Well, let's talk to James Bays. He joins us from UN headquarters in New York. James, earlier we heard from the Ukrainian ambassador who spoke at the UN. He says Russia's deployed around 16,000 troops or so to the Crimea. What more has he been saying, James?
Well, you heard that phrase, chaos and anarchy, in that Yanukovych letter. Well, I think that's about the only thing that the Ukrainian ambassador agrees with the Russian ambassador on, but he says it's because of the presence of Russian troops. The Ukrainian ambassador speaking in French, in English, and I think most importantly in Russian to make sure his message is heard all around the world, but also heard by the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine and the Crimea, and people who are watching his comments in Moscow and elsewhere in the Russian Federation. Let's listen to what he had to say.
As of today, beginning from 24 February, approximately 16,000 Russian troops have been deployed in Crimea by the military ships, helicopters, cargo airplanes from the neighboring territory of the Russian Federation. The Russian troops keep taking their attempts to seize, block and control crucial governmental and military objects of Ukraine in Crimea. The Parliament of Crimea, all civil and military airports, means of communications, radio stations, customs service, military and Coast Guard bases, headquarters of Ukraine's Navy in Crimea.
And James, the Americans led widespread condemnation at the Security Council of Russian action in Crimea. It was pretty damning, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, the US, France and the UK really leading the charge, but it's pretty clear around the Security Council chamber, Russia does not have any friends. China made a speech. It was a very short speech, and it was sitting on the fence. It didn't really say one way or other what China thought about the situation, as a verbal version of an abstention in a vote. But the Western nations, very strong indeed. This was the US ambassador.
Russian military action is not a human rights protection mission. It is a violation of international law and a violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the independent nation of Ukraine, and a breach of Russia's Helsinki commitments and its UN obligations. The central issue is whether the recent change of government in Ukraine constitutes a danger to Russia's legitimate interests of such a nature and extent that Russia is justified in intervening militarily in Ukraine, seizing control of public facilities, and issuing military ultimatums to elements of the Ukrainian military.
And James, I understand that you spoke to the Russian ambassador about that letter that allegedly came from former President Viktor Yanukovych asking for Russian intervention. What more did the Russian ambassador tell you?
Well, I asked him whether he felt that that letter now was grounds for their intervention, that made their intervention legal, because when you look at the international law, which is in the UN Charter, it says you're not allowed to go and invade other people's countries. He said, well, Mr. Yanukovych, in his view, is still the legitimate president of Ukraine. So clearly that's the Russian position now, a change for the first time, an announcement that Russia has what it thinks is legal justification for involving itself in Ukraine. It has a letter from the man it believes is still the legitimate president, and that it believes means it's acting within international law.
All right, James Bays there at UN headquarters in New York. James, thank you. Well, the European Union also says its member states will consider targeted measures against Russia if it doesn't pull its soldiers back to their bases in Crimea. EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton made the statement after an emergency meeting of EU foreign ministers in Brussels. She called on Russia to withdraw its troops or face possible EU sanctions.
In the absence of de-escalating steps by Russia, the EU will decide what the consequences will be for bilateral relations between the European Union and Russia. We talked about the potential of suspending bilateral talks on visa matters on the new agreement, and we will consider targeted measures.
Al Jazeera's Rowland joins us now from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Jackie, reports that more Russian troops have been arriving in Crimea. This is, of course, against the backdrop of OSCE monitors being deployed on the ground. But, Jackie, big questions remain as to the role and mandate of the monitors.
Yes, I mean, that really is the crucial question, because they need to know exactly what their mission is, what is required of them, what results they're expected to achieve. Also, what territorial, geographical, from a point of view, where they'll be able to deploy, whether it will be all over the territory of Ukraine, whether they'll be able to go into Crimea, whether they would have access also to towns in the far east of Ukraine, where there are predominantly Russian populations that predominantly owe allegiance to Russia. And the other question as well, who would cooperate with them? Would they have the full cooperation of all the parties to this confrontation? And until all of those questions have been answered, it's really difficult to see what kind of impact an OSCE monitoring mission could have in terms of trying to achieve the stated aim of de-escalating the situation here.
And Jackie, what about the fledgling government there in the Ukrainian capital where you are? I mean, how are they likely to respond to reports of this Russian ultimatum that they're coming to get the Ukrainian Navy unless they surrender? I mean, how worried are people there?
Well, this whole business about the ultimatum has really become quite confused and foggy. First of all, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense said that it had received this ultimatum that in a few hours' time, Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian naval vessels down in Crimea would have to surrender or face being stormed by the Russian military. Well, since then, the Russian side has said this is nonsense. We never issued any ultimatum. But the fact that it did do the rounds here in Kiev, I think is really an illustration of how nervous people are, how twitchy they are, and really a reflection of the fact that there's a tense period of anticipation here. People are waiting to see what the next move might be. They're expecting that the next move will be made by the Russians. I think in many ways the Ukrainians themselves, although they won't admit it, actually feel quite impotent, certainly from a military point of view. So it's a sort of waiting game, and obviously in this kind of atmosphere people are very nervous and will react to the slightest rumour or report.
All right, Jackie Rowland there in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Jackie, thank you.